That wraps up the material for the built-in functions. Here is a summary. So functions complete a specific task, and the built-in functions are available immediately in every Python program. In order to use your functions, you're going to need to call them, which is simply a word for saying get the function name and put parentheses at the end. Here are different ways to call functions depending on whether or not it takes arguments. Arguments are simply just inputs into the function. This function, which we're just calling func1, has no arguments. Func2 has a single argument, a string. Func3 has 3 arguments. They are separated by commas. All functions will return an object even if it is none. So no matter what, you're getting something back. A lot of times it is none. We then took a look at all the math functions, which there are several. Abs, you pass it in some number, it'll return the absolute value. Divmod, you pass in 2 numbers, it divides them and returns that number, that's the quotient, and then it also returns the remainder. So you can do this without divmod using integer division and modulus division. And it returns it as a tuple, which we'll talk about in an upcoming module. All right, the min function, you pass it in some sequence, like a list or even a string, and it'll return the minimum value. Likewise, max returns the maximum value. You don't have to pass in a sequence. You can just pass in a bunch of arguments separated by commas for either min or max. Pow takes in 2 arguments. It raises the first one to the second one as a power. This is also done with the exponentiation operator. The round method takes in 2 arguments, some number, and then what decimal place you want to round it to. So if you don't give it a decimal place, it will just round it to the nearest integer. The sum function, you must give it some sequence, and it will just sum it up. We talked about how you can change the starting value. It defaults to 0, but it can also be another number. We then looked at many other functions, built-in functions. The any/all functions, these must be passed and iterable, and they will return true or false. They always return a Boolean, and any returns true if just one of the values in the sequence is true. All returns true if all of them are true. Otherwise, they return false. Then we talked about the CHR and ORD functions. So they kind of work together, and one is the opposite of the other. So CHR takes in a number, converts it to a character. ORD takes in a character and converts it to a number. That number is the Unicode code point. DIR, think of this as like the directory. You pass it in any object, string, a list, an integer, a float, and it will return a list of all the attributes and methods as strings. So this is like a glossary of everything that the object is capable of doing. And the attributes and methods that begin with an underscore, those are private and not meant for you to use publicly in your programs. All right, the print function, which we've already used a lot, prints text to a screen. You can actually print multiple objects, just separating them by a comma. You can change the spacing using the sep and end parameters. The ID function, you can pass it in any object, and it will return that object's location in memory as an integer. We talked about the difference between variable names and objects. So just assigning one variable name to another variable name doesn't actually create an object in memory. It simply just creates a new variable name that references that same object. The len function will return the length of some sequence as an integer. So whether it's a string or a list, or in the future a tuple, dictionary, set, whatever, it will just return that as a number. The sorted function will take in some iterable and sort it and return it as a list. It always returns it as a list. It does not change the underlying object that is passed to it. All right, so that's the summary of our built-in functions.